This is part 2 of my conversation with my guest and expert witness, Dr Celia Sadie, clinical psychologist and director of care and wellbeing at Oasis Restore, England's first ever secure school based in Rochester in Kent. We talked together about Principle 5. You can judge the wisdom of any society by the investment it makes in its children. It was brilliant talking with Celia, because getting to work with her day by day as we prepare to open Oasis Restore, I know that she understands the revolution that we need to go through if we're to give every young person in our society the opportunity they deserve and allow them to reach their full potential. Well, Celia, I don't know what you make of all of that, but what I'd like to do is just begin by you explaining a little bit about Oasis Restore and what it is. You come to work in the team at Oasis Restore as our lead psychologist, responsible for the well-being of the people that will come to us. But what is Oasis Restore and who will come to us?
Well, this is a very exciting story. Oasis Restore is a school for children who would otherwise be in prison. Essentially, we're going to look after up to 49 children year-round for as long as they are sentenced or on remand. And we're going to offer them a completely different experience from what they would currently go through in the youth custody estate and probably from anything they've experienced ever before. A truly therapeutic environment, people who are longing to get to know them and to be alongside them, making sense of what's happened to them and helping them on their way, and providing a really enriching educational offer so that they genuinely have the prospect of a future they can really be proud of.
Why is that different to the youth justice system as we know it at the moment?
Well, the youth justice system as it stands relies on a set of provisions for children in custody that were set up over the last, well, actually some of them originally set up in the very distant past, many, many decades ago, based on the understandings that were around then about what worked with young people or what worked in terms of protecting the public from them. And there have been many, many attempts to adapt and change the practice in those settings, and some have been more successful than others. But ultimately, lots of them are hampered by certain aspects of their design and staffing. So the Secure Schools policy was a huge shot of energy into a system that's been really quite tired, quite damaged, quite starved of resource for many years. And it offers, I think, real potential for doing something radically different for children.
And we chose to call it Oasis Restore, of course. I think that was me who chose that
I
name.
love it.
Yeah.
I love it. It's perfect.
Because it's about restoration.
Yeah.
It's not about punishment. It's not about retribution. It's not about what have you done wrong. It's about what's happened to you and how do you move forward as a person.
Yes, exactly. And you know, in the name Restore, there's the absolute kind of centre of our practice, which is about restorative work. So that starts from day one, and it's about looking with the child at what has happened to them and how they've become accustomed to approaching the world, thinking about themselves, thinking about their relationships, and thinking about what we can strengthen and build with them and what skills they need in order to be able to get on with people and to be able to be part of society again, because we're looking forward to that point from the very beginning.
And I know, simply because we've been working on this for some time now, that there are some people who would say, but actually people don't move on. You know, a criminal's a criminal. You've got to lock people up. Sentences should be longer and longer. It's no good going soft on things. Instead of seeing these people as children who need therapeutic care, see them for what they are. They're criminals and they deserve punishment.
I think that's a really understandable point of view. The things the kids will have done are really, really damaging. I mean, they've caused pain that will last some people's whole lives, or have totally destroyed lives. And so the provision of something therapeutic for them, I can see, might feel really uncomfortable for some people. But I guess you have to ask yourself, how do you want them to emerge from custody at the end of all of this? Because they will come out. And that means really exploring what makes a difference, so that the people who come out are not embittered, are not raging about what's happened to them, and have not been denied the opportunity to develop as human beings, but actually have had a chance really to think about it, really to make amends, and really to build themselves up, so that's something they will never do again. So, I mean, I think you have to take that perspective ultimately, particularly in my position, if you're part of designing something like this. And I think that's why it's really important that it's a school, and not a prison, because we go to school to learn. And the whole point of a school is to foster development. So we expect them to change. We know people change all the time, particularly when shaped by environments that are thought about in a very intentional way to make that possible. Whereas a prison really is more about containing them in a physical sense, and not necessarily with the expectation of change, more protection of the public, and control, potentially punishment of them. So calling it a school, designing it as a school, registering it and regulating it as a school is incredibly important in enabling us to stay focused on that idea of learning and development and nurturing them.
I always think of some of this in terms of a pressure cooker. Pressure cookers aren't very popular now for some reason, but when
They sound a bit scary, Steve.
yeah.
Sound
Well,
like
when
they
I
might
was
explode.
my mum had one, and she used to cook with this pressure cooker all the time. So it's like a big saucepan thing, isn't it? And you bolt the top on somehow, and this pressure builds up inside it, and so everything gets cooked quick, And I often think about all of this in those terms. So in the life of a young person, the pressure builds up and up and up and up, which is why they switch, which is why they kick off, which is why they lose it, which is why their prefrontal cortex, as I say, gets overloaded and they lose control. And what, therefore, the youth justice system needs to be about, the justice system, full stop, needs to be about, is helping somebody handle that pressure or reduce that pressure, develop ways of dealing with that pressure, which is often always about looking back and helping them understand the things that do trigger them. So, a child who watched, I know somebody just like this, actually, he watched his father murder his mother in the kitchen. He watched her beat her. He watched him beat her to death. And as a teenager, whenever he saw a man the kind of size and shape of his father, he just kicked off in school, but never realized that what was happening. He just didn't understand it. And 40 minutes or so, half an hour after he'd kicked off again and punched the teacher or whatever it was, he couldn't understand why he'd done it. Once he'd got, once the pressure had been released.
The power of the unconscious, Steve. It's with us all the time. And I guess a lot of what we've been thinking about in the design of the school is creating opportunities where those kind of links can be made, where children and the staff with them can start to notice the fine detail of what's happening in those interactions, and it's going to go wrong. That's just absolutely to be expected. Things are going to go wrong, and we're going to learn from it, and we're going to learn about what those underlying ideas are. But it requires us to build relationships with children from the very beginning. That's the absolute foundation of all of it, because without the relationship, you won't have the depth or the refinement of the observation of what's happening with a child, or their participation in the conversation about it, to be able to unravel something like that. And, obviously it's a devastatingly sad story you've just told. And part of my sadness hearing it is thinking how agonizing that no one was able to notice that with him earlier and make that link with him. And it requires, really skilled, beautiful youth work or wonderful therapy for someone to pay that much attention to you, to give you their undivided attention and to enable you to trust them enough to have the conversation that leads you to realise that's what's going on there. So I really hope that's what we're going to be able to do. It's absolutely our intention.
Now, you've worked in the youth justice
Yeah.
system for a while, so what you're talking about is it's not some theory out of a PhD.
No.
It's the reality of having worked in the system.
It is. Although to be able to do that work in the system as it has stood in the past is really, really difficult. I mean, prior to working in the justice system, I worked in adolescent units and therapeutic communities, which at that time anyway, can't speak for them now, it's been a while, were places where you could form really good relationships with children, where you had a team around you who understood them from lots of different perspectives and could work with you and them to get to that kind of understanding. And so I sort of hoped moving into youth custody as a psychologist that we could recreate that there. And to some extent you can, but you are within a generally very frightening and depriving environment. So it's very difficult to do that in a way that really fits and really works. So Oasis Restore is really an amazing opportunity to be able to design that from scratch for these kids and do it really well.
In what I was saying, that arises out of this principle in my book, I was saying a little bit earlier that we have this kind of fundamental attribution theory that says I'm a good guy, you're a bad guy, we're different. So we divide the world up, don't we, into good people and bad people.
Yeah.
And some people, we say, they're fundamentally bad. He's bad, she's bad. As a psychologist, what's your commentary on that?
Well, I wouldn't like to rule out the possibility that some people's badness is harder to figure out than others. But very rarely in my career have I come across anyone for whom I could not understand how they'd come to do what they did, knowing what their life had been like and who they were. And perhaps the ones I didn't understand were my failure to understand and nothing to do with them. I also just don't think it's helpful to start from the starting point that some people are good and some people are bad, because then you've given up on the bad ones essentially, and that stops you being able to create something meaningful with them. So and find out you were wrong. So I always start from the point of view of discovery with them about who they are and what's happened and what meaning they've made of it. And then, perhaps the finer details of their kind of moral worth will come later. But it's almost everything seems to me understandable if you really put yourself in their shoes. And the fundamental attribution error problem is real. It's real, and it's because we can't really read each other's minds that well, and we particularly can't read them when we're dysregulated. I mean, we're talking about them as if they're not us. We are all them, and we could all do what they've done, given the certain circumstances and the level of distress or overwhelm they were in at the time. And that's what I bear in mind in every moment when I'm with those children. The other thing I do is, thinking about this yesterday actually, when what they've done feels intolerable to think about, and so painful that it gets in the way of the interaction, I find myself thinking about them visually in the room as if they were a small child. When I started working in custody, my children were 2 and 5. So it was really easy to imagine the kids I was working with kind of shrunk down to miniature size and sitting in those chairs with their legs hanging off the edge, looking all squidgy and lovely like children do. And as soon as you remember that they were once tiny, all of that all of that barrier of knowing what they did starts to dissolve a bit, and you can listen to who they really are.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you should say that, because I've got a friend who told me that he works with children who find it hard to regulate their behaviour in an urban context, and he works with gangs. He's a youth worker. And he told me a story about how he took them all in a minibus or coach or something to a children's play park, a big theme park, and there were loads of trees, and there was grass to run around on, and all the rest of it. And he said he'd taken these kids, from this urban environment where you view them as tough and and impenetrable, and he took them down into the countryside. And he said, I just sat there and they ran around like little boys, and they were climbing trees and having fun. The same point you're making, isn't it? That they are just kids looking for fun, purpose, meaning, belonging, hope.
Absolutely. This is where your relentless love thing has really influenced my thinking. And also, I guess for me, the experience of becoming conscious of the relentless love with which I am treated by some people in my life, and the impact it has had and has on me, to know what it feels like to be loved and to be treated as precious. And that is something that I feel is absolutely essential that we give to these children, and give it in a very intentional way, because there's a lot in the way of giving that in these systems. And there's a lot in their behaviour that makes it harder for us to stay with that idea. But it's so fundamental, it's so important, and it's so transformative.
We need a society that allows people to move on.
We certainly do, because it's of no benefit to them or us if we don't. And that, and it denies that beautiful, precious humanity that is at the heart of everybody in the very beginning, and that gets really horribly damaged by life circumstances. And I thought that was very powerful in what you were saying about brain development and trauma and all of that. And for these kids, the trauma has really just smashed through and short-circuited systems that are designed to take quite a bit of stress. I mean, human beings don't need to be wrapped in cotton wool. We actually benefit from a certain degree of adversity and life experience, and in any case, it's inevitable. I think it's a couple of psychologists in Canada and the US, Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, write about the idea of anti-fragility, that actually we're made of anti-fragile material. If we get a bump, we get up again, and we've maybe got a callus or a scar, but it makes us stronger. Actually, our muscles grow through being stretched and torn a little bit, and that enables them to build up. We need some contact with difficulty in order to develop. And that's one of the theories as to why teenagers are so naughty and so risk-taking, is because they're having to amass more experience in order to make better decisions later. They need a bit of contact with difficulty to learn the boundaries of what's safe, and to have the kind of adult maturity that hopefully you and I have in buckets. And so, I mean, that's all very well for 95% of people, but for others who've really been battered by life, and the kids who we're going to be seeing at the school, that's really very serious. It's really damaged their whole selves.
And looking at all this in a broader context, and that theory, that great principle, really, it's not what you've done wrong, what you've done, it's what's happened to you, and unpacking how that impacts our lives. I kind of think to myself, this has huge implications for the whole of society and the way we work, not just for children or people in the justice system, and not just for our educational system, but for the whole of society. So, for instance, in many workplaces, it strikes me, the question becomes, what have you done wrong? Instead of what happened. If you breed a a work ethos or culture in the office of blame. What have you done wrong? You breed a culture where people don't give their best, can't grow, are keen to leave, etc. Whereas if you breed a culture that says, hey, that went wrong, let's have a look at what happened and learn from that together.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that's again something we've really tried to build into the design of the school and of our model. We've borrowed from the psychoanalyst Philip Stokoe this idea of the culture of benign inquiry, that we're always curious about what's going on here. And when things go wrong, we must respond with that curiosity about how did this happen? Where did people start from in their understanding that then this great misunderstanding has occurred? What's really going on in the situation from all the different perspectives, and bring that together to make decisions and to think about how to adapt, rather than looking for somebody whose head to chop off or to sack off, all of that. Because that is an illusion. Usually there's a lot more going on in a situation than one bad apple. So that culture of benign inquiry is something that runs through all of our practice, both in terms of how we look after our staff, who we know will be put under immense pressures in the situations they'll encounter in the school, and may well say or do things that they will regret or they'll wish they'd done differently. And we need to have the grace and the patience to be alongside them to try and understand what happened there, because all of this should be understandable. Now, of course, there are limits to that. I'm not going to pretend that all behaviour is acceptable. Of course, it isn't. But we really are starting with that principle of curiosity about people at the start, and applying that to the children as well. So when things go wrong between them, we want to sit down and have a conversation about it, not say, right, you're in your room for the next 24 hours, you're not coming out, which might well happen in some other settings.
It's important to remember in all of this, isn't it, that no two brains are the same. We're all unique. So you can't say because somebody had this experience followed by that experience and they were abandoned in this situation, they will behave like this, or they'll be stuck in that place.
No, of course not. And people can go through enormous adversity and not commit any crimes or, do this kind of damage to other people. That's absolutely true. So we are extraordinarily idiosyncratic as human beings, and at any point have the potential to do things differently. So no, I don't think these things are destiny, not at all.
And we're also all malleable, aren't we?
Yeah.
This goes on. So we talked about the first 1,000 days and the first 5 years, and we talk about adolescence, etc. But we keep on learning all the time. I had this incredible experience once where I was invited to the school where Tim Henman learnt tennis. It's down in Surrey that I went along to speak, and they took me to the tennis centre there. And these sixth formers, kind of 17, 18-year-olds, were playing tennis, and they got this huge tennis stadium indoor place, and I stood some way behind the baseline, and these were just sixth formers. I'd say just sixth formers, because standing behind the baseline, the guy at the other end was serving, and they're like, he's not Tim Henman, and he's not Andy Murray, and he's not, etc. But the speed that ball came down. I mean, these are just kids.
Gosh.
Like, the speed was unbelievable. And it was like a bullet coming at you. And yet the other sixth former at the other end was always able to get to the ball, control it, and return it. It's just incredible. And it got me to thinking that that's about a neural pathway, isn't it?
Certainly is, yeah.
So any habit that we develop, you work on that connection in your brain and it becomes second nature. So I've got some funny neural pathways. So well, no, I have, because when our kids were growing up, I often used to take them to school, like Monday to Friday mornings, or some of the mornings. My wife would contest that.
Well,
I did drive them there, but it would be like Saturday or Sunday, and I'd get in the car to go somewhere else, and then I'd end up outside their school And you can, and that's a neural pathway, isn't it? It's a habit you've developed.
Yeah.
So, but our brains keep developing, don't they? We can always learn. We can always move forward. So something that seems impossible, like returning the tennis ball or driving where you want to go, if you concentrate, you'll make a new pathway.
Yeah. And, you can see them in yourself potentially all the time. And certainly having children, you're watching them develop live in front of you. And it's wild sometimes. And for me, coming to this role in Oasis has been an extraordinary learning curve. And I've ended up doing things I've never done before. I had no idea how to do. Some of them have gone better than others. But even just this week, I found myself doing things and realizing I've learned something really quite profound in the process. So yes, there's hope for all of us. Absolutely. And thinking of that, Steve, it takes me back to the story you told at the very beginning about your wife and you setting up number 3. And the great love and generosity in your offer to these kids and your hopefulness that was then really ground down into the mud when they stripped the house of everything that you'd worked so hard.
Ground down into anger.
Yes, into anger. I know. And when you were saying anger, I was thinking devastation. I was thinking you're left in the ruins, and it's not only anger under that, it's such sadness, such disappointment that you wanted it to be something and then it wasn't. And yet, I think, as time has told, it wasn't wasted. That moment was pretty grim, I'm sure, for all of you. But there's been enormous learning for you in that, and no doubt for your wife, and possibly for the kids who were there staying with you at the time. And I think, there's so much depth in that story about what you were left with when they stripped the house of all of those precious things. That feeling of being used and rubbish and cheated and ruined. Naive, yeah. All of the feelings that those kids must have experienced earlier in their lives in the situations they were in, that they were finding a way to show you really in a very raw way what it felt like to be them, really angry, really dispossessed, literally dispossessed. So you then had to endure that and find a way to work through it with them, with each other, and to, discover your resilience in terms of your life goal, which was making places like this work. And some of that is a little bit of kind of realism in the expectation of how what you're offering is going to be treated. It's not always going to be valued in the way that you intend. And we're going into running the school knowing that, and it's painful because we're trying to make it beautiful, and we know that things will get kicked and torn down and all of that. And our commitment is to keep putting them back up again and repainting it and talking about what's happening with the kids, because we know that they will have so many experiences of being rubbished and rejected, and they will show that to us in the relationships and in the fabric of everything around them. And we have to stick with it, I think. And this is tough for anyone who comes into these professions with really high hopes and love in their hearts and, all the rest, that you have to dose that with a little bit of caution and actually even make it exciting. Approach it thinking this is going to be tricky. How are we going to deal with it when it gets tricky? Because there's no other way it can be. So, yeah, sort of hats off to you and Cornelia, sticking with it. And, 40 years later, here we are.
Yeah, so I realised again that everything that happens to us shapes us.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Everything matters because everything shapes us. And an extraordinary thing happened to me a few years ago. I was asked by one of the political parties to go in and chat at their headquarters with them. And I was going through the main office to a meeting room at the end, and this woman in her 40s, I guess, saw me coming and said, wow, oh, it's great to see you, Steve, and rushed up to me and gave me a kiss.
Oh.
Yeah. And I hadn't got a clue who she was, not a clue. And so I went and had this meeting, and at the end, I wandered back out, and there she was again. And she said, Steve, was it a good meeting? It's great to see you, whatever. So I said, I was honest. I said, do you know something? You've been so kind to me, but I haven't got a clue who you are. I'm really sorry. I've got a bad memory. And she said, you must remember me. I said, I think it was my face that gave away. I didn't. And she said, remember, I used to live with you. I really don't remember this. And she said, down in Peckham at number 3, this house. And I still didn't remember her. And she said, yeah, remember me? I was the one who smashed the window in my bedroom and smashed up my bed. And I said to her, that's why I don't remember you. I'd have only remembered you if you were the one who didn't smash the window.
Oh.
It's kind of like, but the incredible thing is that everything that happens to us matters and changes us. And here she was in this really high-powered job,
Oh, wow.
working for one of the big political parties very centrally, and her pathway had begun in that place. So we can move on. We do change. Our brains are malleable. There is always hope. And it's time for all our policies, our social policies, to catch up with the science and that fact.